So an absolutely enormous Warhammer 40k rules drop today. We have the Balance Dataslate, Murator and Field Manual, and a fair few other things besides. Exciting times for some factions, though some factions are going to absolutely hate it. We've got big boosts for Knights, Custodes and Drukhari, and some fairly nasty nerfs for Space Marines, World Eaters, Aeldari and Chaos. Let's talk through all the changes and what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we've got an enormous shake-up for the game of Warhammer 40k. Changes for just about every faction in the game, though there are some pretty disappointing exceptions, not going to lie. And now we can finally get a hold of what 40k is going to look like for the next few months, what stuff is going to be buffed, nerfed, and what's going to be staying the same. The rules update, I would argue it is really quite a big one. It definitely isn't affecting all factions equally. There's some factions who have had some very minimal changes or none at all, where some factions have had the vast majority of their points rewritten alongside special rules and things. And Games Workshop has delivered this basically in 4 separate parts, so there might be some other minor bits among the different indexes that I haven't properly seen. First up, of course, we have the Balance Dataslate itself. It does look like this one is going to be changing just faction rules as opposed to be messing with the core stratagems like they did last time with things like Overwatch or Insane Bravery. Almost every faction got at least some changes, though notably there was absolutely nothing for the Abmech, Necrons and Thousand Sons. I feel like the Thousand Sons maybe weren't in the worst place in the world, but Abmech and Necrons were pretty much at different ends of the power spectrum, and it is disappointing that they didn't get any updates. Alongside that, we've got the Murator and Field Manual. That's all the points changes from Games Workshop, and actually they have labelled each change with not only that it has changed, but also whether it's gone up and down as well, which I think is really quite a nice plus. And again, along with the Balanced Dataslate between the two, we've got changes for most factions, and we do have the new points for the Dark Angels as well, which I thought I'd cover in a separate video given that it's kind of in context of their new codex. I'm going to aim that to be the next one after this. Then, besides actual balance stuff, we have the Games Workshop Designer's Commentary, which is basically their equivalent of the FAQ or errata document for 10th edition. Here it seems that they have actually provided us basically with FAQ and errata answers to a bunch of things that they left unclear in the game, things that have been sort of obvious since the inception of 10th edition. And broadly I'd say that there's no major surprises here. Maybe one of the most interesting is that redeployabilities do look like you can use them paired with Infiltrate, which is quite a big boost to those units that can get it. And I'll aim to comb through those in a separate video as well. For the most part, they don't impact most units in the game. Finally, and perhaps the biggest surprise out of the update is that Drukhari got a new detachment. Maybe Games Workshop is going to say sorry to the faction that is most underpowered each turn by giving them a feels good new detachment as a consolation prize. Only a theory, that one, but it seems like it could be a pretty easy way to earn some popularity points with that army. And again, seeing as that's a big topic in its own right, that'll be a separate video for me. Looks like I'm going to have a busy next few days. And I'll also hopefully be aiming to make a few videos focusing on individual faction changes to expand a bit on what we say here. Let's jump straight into it though and start going through the armies. First up we have the Space Marines. Kind of an oddball one given that the average army of Space Marines I wouldn't say is particularly strong right now, but they still seem to be topping tournaments with certain list builds, maybe most notably the Vanguard Ultramarines Centurion Devastator build that we'd seen recently. They've had no actual rules changes, it's all points. They just have the Desolation Marines remaining at squad size 5 from the Balanced Dataslate, though unfortunately their points nerfs have hit some of the best units in the army. I feel like the single worst nerf to their power level will be to Inceptors. Going up to 130 from 110 is kind of huge on the Space Marines' best point scorers. I expected them to increase, but maybe not quite by this much. They're going to be far more of a luxury now and probably won't be spammed as much. Scouts were also one that I could see going up very easily. They went from 55 to 65, but I think are still kind of fine at that level. They're still a cheap forward deploy unit with some special rules. The Redemptor went up slightly to 210, still okay but a bit less standout. Centurion Devastators went up a little to punish them for their interactions in Vanguard Spearhead, I guess. Aggressors went up from 110 to 120, kind of sad for them given that they're the centre point of quite a lot of combos out there. And the Whirlwinds took an absolutely brutal nerf, going up from 145 to 180. I feel like that went from kind of good in certain lists to utterly bad now. Maybe they don't want too many people getting excited about firstborn tanks that might be removed in the future. For the buffs, they buffed a similar amount of units, Guilliman going down to 350, Sternguard to 90, which I think does make them genuinely a bit more interesting now, given that they were a bit underpowered before. The 3 flavours of Intercessors all dropped 5 points. I feel like they were all usable, but now seem a bit more standouts. Heavy Intercessors at 100 points does seem really quite chunky for the amount of Gravis wounds that you get there. The new Inferno squad drops down to 80, which I think is pretty nice. Very good for Salamanders or Firestorm, I guess. And the Outriders get the single biggest points cost reduction, going down from 95 to 80. I think that's enough to make them a genuinely interesting skirmish unit, which they really weren't before, and could be good for Dark Angels with Ravenwing. Overall though, I don't think that this is looking great for Space Marines. It is overall a nerf in my opinion. Staple units that loads of competitive lists take went up in cost, where things that tended to be a bit more niche and not quite as taken went down, which is definitely good for internal codex balance, but particularly with things like the Inceptors and Scouts, they were taken in a lot of lists, and overall I feel like most army lists will go up a bit compared with what they were before. It is kind of a surprising move for an army that had a fairly low win rate overall, and I do feel like a few of the buffs, while things like Outriders I think were very justified, and same with Stern Guard, lots of the others could have been targeted at units that were more niche than the Intercessors, say like Tactical Marines and Reavers, still no love for them apparently. Otherwise, the Divergent chapters got a few changes. Blood Angels I think will be disappointed really. They did get a nice boost to Red Thirst in the Sons of Sanguinius detachment, going to +2 strength on the charge for their models rather than +1, and they still get the +1 attack thing. But overall I don't think that that's going to be enough to really make it a better detachment from the ones in Codex Space Marines. If you were playing the lore-friendly Blood Angels detachment though, then it will help with Strength 4 against things like Toughness 3, 5 or 6. Good news for anything with chainswords I guess, and Power Fists and Thunderhammers going to Strength 10 on the charge is a pretty meaningful breakpoint, and they'll be a lot more popular there. I was maybe a bit disappointed to see literally no points changes for Blood Angels, given that a lot of the index is pretty overcosted. Certainly Sanguinary Guard could have come down a bit at the very least, but otherwise I feel like Blood Angels are still going to be one of the most struggling armies in the game after this. For the Space Wolves, they're not in quite as terrible a shape. At least they do have a pretty good competitive build in Thunderwolves with Stormlands. I feel like that's still likely to remain the case. Games Workshop did try and help out the Champions of Rust detachment, which is rarely played competitively, by making the sagas a little bit easier. Now they can be done in each of the players' turns rather than at the end of each battle round, which does mean that you might be able to get more sagas on the go a bit quicker if you happen to satisfy the criteria in different turns, or potentially not have to wait till the boost until the next battle round. It definitely doesn't hurt, and I think it's a step in the right direction, but I still can't see this being enough to tip the balance for Champions of Rust from going from being very weak to usable. It's still just not going to help you at all if you've got an enemy army that just doesn't allow you to do the sagas well, as all of them are sort of situational and opponent dependent. Otherwise no points changes, and I feel like it's going to be Thunderwolf spam being the core of the army at the moment. For the Black Templars, I'm perhaps not surprised to see a few points nerfs here. They were the single strongest Divergent Space Marine chapter by quite some measure, at least in tournament performance. The Firstborn Crusader squad goes up from a surprisingly undercosted 65 points or 120 points to 75 or 150. I feel like at that points level they are still good. 75 points for a Space Marine unit with a las cannon, melter gun, inferno pistol and power fist is rather nice. Hard to go too far wrong with those as cheap chaff that can genuinely threaten tanks. But otherwise it looks like High Marshal Helbrecht and Grimaldus both went up to 120 points, each from 95. Kind of a shame that their standout good characters are a fair bit less standout now. I think both are still playable, Grimaldus with a big block of 20 Crusaders, Helbrecht with some Sword Brethren, but you are going to be paying more of a premium for their great abilities. Otherwise, some of the other stronger elements of their army are completely unchanged as well. I was sort of expecting some of the tanks' multi-melter costs to go up a bit, but it still looks like they're just going to have surprisingly dangerous tanks compared with the rest of Space Marines, and Ironstorm Spearhead is still probably going to have Black Templars as one of its strongest chapters. It does mean things like Impulsors are extra good for them as well for ferrying Sword Brethren around. Otherwise, both Sword Brethren and the Primaris Crusader squad are escaping nerfs as well. Both very solid units in a very good Divergent chapter, so the Primaris Black Templars are still looking pretty nice to me. Deathwatch didn't get any points changes, which is fairly sad for their Primaris kill teams. I feel like most of those are overcosted really and could do with going down. The only thing that does look like it's changed is the bolt weapon list being brought more into alignment. That list looked like it was different from the Warhammer 40k app versus the actual index download, with things like the heavy bolter and the heavy bolt rifle being missing. At least there wouldn't be any debate now as to whether or not they can use the bolt stratagems, which I think is kind of important given that heavy intercessors, particularly in their Gravis armoured kill team, were one of the better targets for the bolt stratagems. Not really a load of help though, and they will be eating some of the Space Marine datasheet nerfs as well on the points changes, so again not really great news out of this. For Dark Angels, just in case anyone missed it at the summary at the start, I'm going to cover their points changes in a new video, and it should be the next one following this ideally. They've got a new codex and brand new points to go with it. All of their points did go down at least, which is kind of nice. They'll probably argue that not all of them as much as they needed to, given the nerfs that they took in the codex. We'll talk about them in the next one. Otherwise, moving beyond Space Marines for the Imperial armies, the Adepta Sororitas had a bunch of changes. It seems that Games Workshop have nerfed the Triumph of St. Catherine slightly. It was a bit of a synergy piece that could allow you to do lots of stacking acts of faith on a single unit, perhaps sometimes a Sisters of Battle units to get some crazy value out of a multi-melter. Now they've limited it, so the Ebon Chalice buff is that you can do 2 acts of faith on one unit and not just spam loads of them into that same squad in the same turn. Overall, I still think it's a good model though. It's very cheap for the amount of wounds and nuisance it brings, even if its damage output isn't standout. I still think it will see play. Otherwise, we do have a few nerfs. Arco-Flagellants going up to 15 points each, rather than about 13 points. Maybe not the worst here, they were kind of dependent on them versus their more iconic units. Exorcists take a perhaps surprisingly severe nerf, going up to 180 from 160. Kind of weird that they went up so much and the Castigator stayed the same in my opinion. GW do seem to be punishing indirect fire here a bit. Morven Val went up to 145 points from 125, which I think isn't the worst change in the world, given that the Paragon Warsuits dropped down from 200 to 170. That does seem like a very sensible internal balance change. Overall, Val plus Paragons will still go down, but it did seem that Paragon Warsuits without Val were just overcosted, and now it looks like there's a bit more value to bringing them individually without the higher best. Otherwise, Dominions dropped down to 110 from 120, which is nice. Repentia went down to 55 from 65, which is a pretty big boost. Retributors to 105 from 115, and Zephyrim down to 60 from 70. I really like all of those changes. I feel like they were the iconic sort of units that got Sister Battle players wanting to play them, and felt like they should be some of the core damage dealers of the index, but just really weren't costed efficiently. They all definitely seem a lot more usable for the points cost now. Broadly, I feel like those changes seem sensible enough. I perhaps feel like the Exorcist is maybe the worst change. I think that's just perhaps a bit too much of an increase, though I guess we'll see. I feel like it'll probably land them in a spot where the majority of Sister Battle units are at least worth thinking about in an army list now. As mentioned at the start of the video, big disappointment for AdMech fans here. No changes at all since their codex dropped in December. And it is kind of disappointing that Games Workshop couldn't have been a bit more proactive with making some changes and tinkering with the faction. I'm pretty sure that the only reason they're not included in the balance changes here is that they haven't had enough time to properly gather data or think about what needs changing for the AdMech, and they're deeming it too close to the codex release. I think it's fairly clear just from fan reactions to the codex coming out that AdMech players aren't particularly happy, and they were really hoping for some sort of updates to make them a bit more interesting this time around. There's definitely a bunch of units that anyone could tell you are a little bit overcosted at the very least. Castellan robots call Archaeopters or Rust Stalkers. Either they could do with better rules or a points decrease. Probably better rules will be the way that most AdMech players want to go. I feel like in reality AdMech probably need a bit more of a sort out than that though, and could probably do with some sort of army-wide improvement to the faction to try and make them a bit more threatening on a per-model basis, as opposed to just repeatedly lowering points of things. In any case, there's going to be plenty of AdMech players disappointed here. Looks like they're waiting until next time. I guess the next opportunity will be 3 months down the line. Adeptus Custodes have been one of the weakest armies in Warhammer 40k for a little while now. A bit of an overcorrection with the last Balance Dataslate that had a lot of their units as overcosted, but now Games Workshop seems to have made some moves to righten the scales a bit. One kind of expected rules boost to the Aegis of the Emperor, and a few points drops for their more core units with their plastic line. The Aegis of the Emperor took a big nerf last time round in that it's a defense against mortal wounds and didn't work against devastating wounds anymore, which were perhaps the biggest threat on that front to the Custodes. It now works against devastating wounds as well, so at least their detachment rule does a bit more against more factions now. Otherwise they did keep the other balance changes like the squad size limitations, and there aren't any new ones as have been rumoured in those fake leaks that we looked at a while back. There's no change to the squad size of the Adeptus Terminators, for example. Otherwise though, basically the points cost of the core plastic range of the army went down. Adeptus Terminators are 65 points, Wardens are 50, Guard are 45, versus Praetor jet bikes drop to 75, and the jet bike captain drops to 140. That won a massive decrease from 180 there. Seems pretty good overall. I'd guess that from those impressions that I'd still say that people might be more tempted to build around Wardens and Alvarus versus Custodian Guard and versus Praetors, but they're certainly all a lot more playable than they used to be. Broadly seems sensible. I'm sure that will help Custodes out to the extent where they're pushed a bit more towards the midfield in competitive. Probably still going to remain an army that does far better in casual versus competitive though, just by the way that they work. For the Astra Militarum, I think the reaction's going to be more one of disappointment here. I feel like overall they probably needed a bit of a boost as a faction as they were towards the weaker end of Warhammer 40k, but it seems that Games Workshop felt that they were close enough within their Goldilocks zone that they didn't want to actually give them any power boosts. They basically made two small changes to the faction. One, a buff to officers in transport, as it means that once you've disembarked from a transport you can then issue an order now. Previously they could not do that as they were locked out of it due to being within it in the command phase, unless you were in a Chimera. I think this one's a really great and pretty sensible change, to be honest. It's a lesson that they learned in the 9th Guard Codex that I was sort of disappointed that they didn't decide to implement in the 10th edition index, as a lot of officers might well want to be riding around in Tauroxes, Valkyries or other things with their squads and be able to actually function with an order basis once they get out. Definitely a boost for certain mechanised formations there. The other change though I think is a bit of a stupid one really. The Manticore increases all the way up to 180 points for some reason. I can't believe that this is the only change that they made to the Guard Index points cost, and it's such a bad one. I'm not saying that for internal balance purposes they couldn't have nerfed the Manticore, but honestly something like 5 or 10 points would have been fine if they really wanted to go that way. It's just gone from being kind of good to probably never played at that sort of points cost. I just don't think it'll compete with the other artillery things that the Guard has, like the Basilisk that can also slow down enemy units. It just seems there was quite a lot more in the Astra Militarum Index that could have used a buff for a greater or lesser extent. Things like the Valkyrie, the Aegis defense line, maybe some of the lesser played support character options. And if you were going to nerf anything, I would have guessed they might have put up Lord Solar, given just how much crazy value you get out of 125 points for him, even if you do have to support him a little bit with other choices. Overall, really like the officer thing, but that Manticore change is just weird, and just feels a bit lazy when they're not helping out any of the other units that clearly need it. Next, we've got the Grey Knights, where Games Workshop have been a bit more targeted here. I think that the biggest change that they've made is really quite a nice one. It seems they've decided to do a focal boost to Nemesis Dreadknights and Grandmaster Nemesis Dreadknights to actually try and make them fulfill their role a fair bit more as the thing that you need to take to try and take out monsters and vehicles, while the Grey Knights just don't really have good efficient options for that. The Heavy Side Cannon gains AP, going from AP-1 to AP2 and gets Ignore's cover. Between the two of those changes, that's really quite a big deal. If you're shooting at a Redemptor in cover with the previous profile, it'd still save on a 2+, now it would save on a 4. Otherwise, their melee gets significantly more dangerous as well. The Great Hammer will be hitting on a 3+, not a 4+, and the sword will be hitting on a 2+. Both options just quite a lot nicer, and given high strength there, they should be able to put the hurt on enemy battle tanks at strength 10. There's been no change in the points cost to either of those, so it's just a boost with rules, but I feel like it's quite a nice one and fairly well targeted to the problems that Grey Knights have. I honestly feel with those buffs that probably does enough to make the Dread Knight actually competitive again, at least against the other units in the army list. It's not all good news though, as Librarians also went up from 100 points to 110 with all of those mortal wounds from Vortex of Doom. I still think they're probably solid enough to see play, but are definitely less auto-include. Now I'd put Drago as my number 1 Terminator character by quite a way. The others maybe caught up a little bit with that. Maybe we might see a few more Terminator units being led by Voldus perhaps. Overall, I'm not sure this is going to do enough to really help out the Grey Knights that much though. They were kind of considered generally weakish before, so could probably have used a bit more help than this, though I must admit I do like the Dread Knight change. For the Imperial Knights, they were doing badly enough that Games Workshop seems to have decided that they clearly needed help, and they got 1 rules boost, and then basically a cross-faction points decrease to make these big Titanic walkers scarier again. Unfortunately, Games Workshop didn't decide to do anything with the Bondsman abilities, which I think myself and quite a few other Knight players might have liked to see return on the big Knights, even if they had to up the cost for that. Still seems that the Questoris Bondsman abilities are going to be for Armigers only. The rules boost, though, makes the Code Chivalric lay low the Tyrant's Oath a whole load better. Instead of just being able to re-roll a dice when you get a result of a 1, you just get to re-roll a hit roll and a wound roll full stop. A bit less convoluted and confusing than the previous wording was, and just a lot more in line with what other factions in Warhammer 40k tend to get. Otherwise, though, it's points boosts all over. Canis Rex goes down to 435 from 460, the Castellan to 425, the Valiant to 530. The Arbiter Helverin drops to 140 from 150, and basically all the other Questoris Knights all drop around about 25 points or so. The only exceptions that didn't actually go down are the Gallant and the Armiter Warglaive, staying stable at 400 and 150 respectively. Overall, I feel like with kind of similar points changes to the big Knights, it's likely to be the same sort of stuff that still sees a lot of play. I feel like Canis Rex, the Warden, and the Crusader might be the most interesting ones, and the Castellan still seems a fair bit better than the Valiant, I'd say, particularly as the Valiant lost Overwatch. Otherwise, the Forge World Knights generally went down as well. Interestingly, the Armiter Moirax is 160, so it's quite a lot closer in value to the Warglaive now, could genuinely be worth a look. The Lancer's down to 465, so is fairly cheap and effective for the massive amount of damage it can bring. And the Castigator's 465 with its Twin Links Bolt Cannon, which I think is a fairly good place as well. Overall, big boost to a faction that was clearly struggling. I feel like for the most part the boost seemed to have fallen on the right things as well. They maybe could have done a little bit to even up the balance between things like some of the lesser played datasheets like the Preceptor versus some of the stronger ones. Finally, for the Imperium, the Agents of Imperium were entirely unchanged. That one's perhaps a surprise to me, given that the Calidus Assassin is taken in quite so many Imperial army lists to bounce around the board doing secondary objectives. It seems to have escaped nerfs despite being an Imperial staple. I feel like it still probably would have seen points if you'd put her up 5 or 10 points or so. Otherwise, nothing's really changed in terms of points or rules. They still have the previous changes to how exaction squads could be fielded, raising the minimum squad size and changing their war gear a little. Moving on to Chaos, and unfortunately the forces of the Chaos Space Marines have truly felt Games Workshop's wrath here. They were winning a whole lot of tournaments before, though I can't help but think that Games Workshop might have overcorrected a bit here between the points and the rules changes. The rules changes maybe aren't ridiculously punitive, but do certainly hit some of the very strongest things that the faction can do in tournament play. Marks of Chaos units have to match the transports mark that they can embark in, so you can't have things like the fairly popular Undivided Chosen in Mark of Nurgle Rhinos with a Nurgle mark on the Rhino to shield it from shooting. The two major stratagems that see loads of use have been toned down. Dark Obscuration is the one that Nurgle marks units can get no shooting at greater than 12 inches against them, and the range on that got increased to 18 inches, so it's not quite as powerful, but still a genuinely scary thing to be able to threaten for units that are slightly further away. Profane Zeal, the undivided one that could give you full hit rolls and wound roll rerolls, that's been toned down to just be the wound reroll part. I feel like that's kind of sensible. I literally said that exact change could be something they could do with it, as it's still very good then. It was a bit dumb with the crazy amount of damage output that you could get for just 1 CP with it before, better than just about any other faction in the game. Otherwise, for rules changes, the Accursed Cultists got a trio of nerfs. They became Objective Control 1 from OC2, though to be fair they'll still be often in a horde, so you'll still have lots of OC points. They now only heal on your command phase, not both yours and your opponent's, so a little bit less use for sneaking extra models onto objectives, and also just less regeneration as a whole. Finally, their points increased to 105 or 210. Previously it was 95 for the mutants plus the torments, and between all that they're definitely a weaker unit than they used to be. Overall, despite 3 different nerfs, though I'm not sure that they've been made unplayable or anything by that, they still do seem like a pretty annoying unit to have on objectives and still will regenerate a bit. Otherwise though, tournament staples have been hit hard. Chaos Lords and Chosen both go up by 20 points apiece. They can still threaten some enormous damage if they do get into combat though and pop that Profane Zeal stratagem. So maybe it's just a little bit in line with their abilities, and they'll not overshadow things like Possessed or Terminators quite as much as they did before. The Dark Commune's gone up to 65 from 55, though is still pretty excellent if you are taking a bigger unit of cultists. I still say them far better for Accursed Cultists than actual cultists though. The popular Forge Fiends go all the way up to 200 points from the previous 180. They do have terrifying and pretty general purpose damage outputs between the marks and the damage buffs they get there, plus multiple copies of Blast. Obliterators go up a little bit less to 180. Warp Talons go from 100 to 110, still brutal at blending infantry. And it seems that the Eye of Tzeentch enhancement goes up a little bit from 30 to 40. The only buff for the faction is the Khorne Lord of Skulls going down to 450 points from 480. I feel like they maybe could have helped out a few other things to balance out the nerfs. Things like the Lord Discordant, Helldrake or Vashtor might be ones that they could look at. But overall, between all these changes, Chaos Space Marines are much diminished as a powerhouse faction. I'd guess they might wind up somewhere sort of mid to lower mid. They still have loads of strength with the sheer amount of damage they can do with their marks and stratagems. But the biggest, most powerful stuff that people are playing really commonly has been watered down significantly. The Death Guard have seen some buffs and some nerfs. I feel like they were overall a fairly balanced faction in 40k previously. Most of their index really quite usable and not doing too badly in tournament rankings. They've seen one rules nerf as natural rules change on the Dataslate. The Biologist Putrefier can now only do their free grenade stratagem once per game, not once per turn. It maybe was a bit too easy to spam Mortal Wounds with them, and they were one of the most commonly spammed characters out of the Virion, maybe not the best for internal balance. Otherwise, Plague Marines went up from 80 points to 90. That will definitely be a big blow to the power of the faction, given that they were being kind of spammed before in competitive lists, but it might not be the worst for internal balance. Death Shroud got a small decrease down from 125 to 120, though I must admit it feels very weird that they got the decrease and not the Blight Lord Terminators. I personally rate the Death Shroud as far stronger than the Blight Lords before. I think it really was the other guys that needed the points decrease, if anyone. Two of the Terminator characters go down, the Lord of Virulence drops all the way to 80, and Typhus drops down to 80 as well. Both of those were kind of fine before, and now they're both great. Perhaps particularly Typhus at 80 points. Even at 100 points, I've seen people occasionally just running him solo just for the mortal wounds and being a scary character threat. At 80 points, that'd be even more viable, and could also happily go with Death Shroud or Poxwalkers. Otherwise, the other big nerf to the faction was the Plague Burst Crawler going up to 180. That was 165 before. I felt that this one was maybe the single most likely units to get a points increase, so I guess people won't be spamming those quite as much as they were. Still, I don't think perhaps nerfed into unusability, but a bit less exciting. Overall, maybe not the worst compared with how some other factions came off. It might lead to lists pivoting a bit further away from Plague Marine spam that we've been seeing recently. Maybe a bit more of a Plague Marine and Death Shroud Terminators on the battle line as a bit more of a mix maybe. For the 1000 Suns, it's no changes at all. I feel like they maybe weren't in the worst balance spot, with lists focusing around their unique units with lots of Rubric Sorcerers, Magnus, maybe the odd Mutalith. They still were placing at some tournaments a kind of okay mid-tier faction. If they could have boosted anything, it might have been maybe Scarab Occult Terminators a little bit, or Zangors. I feel like both of those do feel a bit underpowered compared with Rubrics with Sorcerers, but maybe not to the point where they're not perfectly usable in a more casual setting. You do get a lot of cheapish wounds with invulnerable saves with the Zangors, and the Scarab Occult can still do some potential damage combos. Perhaps 5 points off either unit could have been interesting though. The World Eaters have fared far less well though, and I must admit Games Workshop have been surprisingly brutal to these guys. They were certainly doing okay and definitely winning the odd tournament, and quite a scary army to face, but they maybe didn't seem quite as standout strong as a few of the others. They've got a trio of rules nerfs. The Berserker Glaive just gets +1 attack and +1 damage now. Previously you'd get +D3 of each on the charge. Still probably just about worth it, but a lot more borderline than it was before. Favour of Khorne is an enhancement that was really quite regularly run. That's the one that allows you to re-roll the Blessings dice. Previously it was once per turn, now it's just once per game, which is a huge nerf there. I think you'd have to really question whether or not you want to take that, though even just that once per game thing could give you a genuinely much better chance of getting Angron back on the table, which will be absolutely game changing, maybe even game winning if it happens. I feel like perhaps the World Eaters army list does have a bit too much emphasis on whether or not Angron comes back, which is really quite a big swing either way. I can't help but think that maybe a bit more of a sensible thing might have been to perhaps lessen the impact of that swing if they were going to make one rules change. Otherwise, for some reason, they've weirdly decided to nerf the standard Demon Prince on foot. He gives World Eaters infantry a 5+ invulnerable save rather than a 4 now. He only gives a 4+ invulnerable save out to infantry that already had an invul already. Really not sure what the thinking behind that one was. I've seen that datasheet used occasionally, though I wouldn't say it's a staple in every competitive list for World Eaters that I've seen. That change in particular does just feel a bit odd. Otherwise though, they've had some nerfs to the Master of Executions going up to 100 from 80, Khan the Betrayer going up to 100 from 80, 8-bound going up to 145 from 135, and Exalted 8-bound going up to 160 from 150. The nerfs to the characters do hurt a bit, I think. They were both really quite popular, jumping out of Rhinos alongside Berserker units, and perhaps one of the reasons that you wanted to run Berserker units in the first place. I'm not sure a full 20 points was needed, maybe more like 10 might have been a bit more sensible. Otherwise, those nerfs to the 8-bound will definitely rack up to a fair few less points in an army list. Most World Eaters lists do tend to go fairly heavy on them. Overall, this is definitely amounting to a fairly significant power nerf to the faction. Finally though, they have got a points boost for the Lord of Skulls going down to 150, and the World Eaters Forge Fiend dropping down to 145. The Lord of Skulls is genuinely fairly scary in World Eaters. We might genuinely see a few more odd lists where you take more than one of those on the table. The Forge Fiend was weirdly overcosted and feel like it had been roped in with the standard Chaos Space Marine one, which gets access to big shooting packs with Dark Pacts and things. Overall though, kind of surprised to see the World Eaters hit quite this hard. I would have probably gone a bit more light touch myself. I'll be interested to hear what you think though. For the Chaos Demons though, it's pretty much good news. Far more boost compared with nerfs, and just one rules change that has been a small nerf to Chaos in general. Their allies rule has weakened, meaning that if you want to take a datasheet out of Codex Chaos Demons, you need to take at least one battle line unit from that same deity. So say for example, if you wanted a Bloodthirster in your army list, you'd have to take a unit of Bloodletters alongside. Kind of interesting that it won't really impact the Nurglings that people often like to take. They've been kind of present in a lot of Chaos lists, just as things that can either infiltrate and deep strike, and are good for the secondary game due to that. Though they did go up to 40 points, which means they're a little bit less auto-include, though I still feel like a unit or two is generally going to be a good move for most Chaos armies. It does seem kind of sensible to limit the impact of that rule a little bit. I feel like having literally any Chaos Demons datasheet just being able to be poached by another faction maybe wasn't the best thing for them, which wasn't the best thing in the world. Otherwise, alongside the Nurglings, the Blue Scribes went up slightly, 75 from 65. They really don't do that much, but they've been seen in a lot of allied Chaos lists as a fast-moving lone operative, which just has value in itself, zipping around and doing secondaries or contesting objectives if they can. Broadly speaking though, it really is a big power boost to the Chaos Demons index. A hefty chunk of their datasheets went down at least by a bit. For Khorne, Blood Crushers and Bloodletters both dropped a bit. For Slaanesh, Demonettes, Fiends, the Seeker Chariot, and regular Seekers all went down. For Tzeentch, Flamers and Screamers both got cheaper, both at 75 points. Nurgle Plaguebearers are looking very tough for the cost at 110 points if you want a sturdy objective holder. The Great Unclean One and Rotigus are both 230 points. The Great Unclean One really is quite nice with that 5+ Feel No Pain enhancement as well. Fate Weaver's 270, the Keeper of Secrets is 290, the Soul Grinder drops a few points, and quite a lot of the various types of heralds go down a bit. Around about half the HQ datasheets have dropped by a few points. Overall, quite a big points boost and maybe more than I was expecting for Demons. It does feel like quite a lot of Demons players haven't been particularly excited to play their army following the nerfs earlier in the edition. I feel like this one will help out and seems to be at least fairly well targeted to datasheets that were struggling a little more. It's quite cool to see the lesser demons get boosts. Maybe we'll see a few more Bloodletters, Demonettes and Plaguebearers on the table. Lastly, for Chaos, it also seems to have been perhaps surprisingly good news for the Chaos Knights. The story of their army in competitive times has generally been that everyone was spamming War Dogs and not taking the big knights, and for the most part, Games Workshop seems to have tried to rebalance things against that. 1 points nerf to the War Dog Brigand, going up from 160 to 170 points, and then really quite a lot of points drops for the big knights. I think the Brigand change is tolerable. Quite a lot of competitive lists were still spamming like 6 other things, so it's not like they weren't overshadowing other things in the index. And the War Dog Carnivore seems to have escaped any attention. That was also being spammed, and it still remains at 140 points, so will still be pretty great. It's pretty fun to see some actual substantial decreases to the big knights though. The Abominant is down to 400 points from 455, the Desecrator to 425, the Tyrant to 510, and most of the Forge World Knights go down a bit as well in a similar sort of fashion to the Imperials. Literally every datasheet drops at least by a bit there. They have also tried to balance out the War Dog Executioner a bit. That one's dropped down from 150 to 140. It really wasn't worth looking at compared with the Brigand before. Now there's a 30-point differential, maybe a few people might be a bit more tempted by that if you wanted a cheap War Dog to guard the home field. Really glad that they gave the Abominant such a good points decrease overall. I'm still not sure if it's quite enough to get it to be regularly played competitively, but 400 points is fairly cheap for a big Titanic Knight. The Battle Shock rule for it is genuinely kind of handy. Its melee is alright against elites, it's just perhaps the Volkite gun that's a letdown compared with some of the others, being very swingy on whether or not you get those devastating wounds. Moving into Xenos, and it seems that Aeldari have been hit hard. It was kind of unsurprising that the faction was going to take some further big nerfs, given that Games Workshop have had them as the strongest army in 40k for quite a while. I feel like they are probably going to lose their top spot, and specifically lose it to Necrons, in my opinion. Though kind of surprisingly, Games Workshop seems to have gone all in the rules nerfs for the Aeldari. That hasn't really changed points all that much. Going through the rules changes, the Strands of Fate dice were nerfed in quite a big way. You only get 6d6 at the start of the game rather than 12. Eldra's now increasing the total to 9 rather than 15. It might be that he is a little bit more tempting as a result, given that they're so much in more limited supply now. Looks like they might have removed the restriction about them only being able to be used once per phase though, but I guess that might not be the biggest deal in the world if you get so few of them. I feel like it would probably enhance the value of things like Guardian Defenders to try and rustle up more Fate dice. I feel like they could come back a fair bit alongside a Farseer if you do want to have a few more to play around with. But overall, that's certainly a big nerf to the faction. Otherwise, perhaps their best enhancement, Fate's Messenger, was one that allowed you to flip a dice to a 6, both on the offensive and the defensive. That one previously affected the bearer's unit and was commonly used on Wraith Guards just to ignore failed saves or trigger some devastating wounds. It now only affects the bearer and not the bearer's squad. Maybe a bit more helpful for things like Autarch fusion guns and things, but that is one nerf to the whole Wraith Guard and Spirit Seer combo. Phantasm, one of their best stratagems, picked up a further nerf. Previously it was limited to infantry only, allowed you to do a big reactive move after you'd seen exactly where your opponent had moved, and then just pick one squad on the board and move it. Previously I believe that it was move a normal move of 7 inches, now it's moved d6 inches. So if you get unlucky with that roll, your unit might just have spent a stratagem and not really got any significant repositioning. If you want things to be able to be hidden behind terrain reliably, you'd have to be very close to those ruined walls and things. Still a potentially very powerful stratagem, but there's going to be a lot riding on how much you roll for that thing, and that might deter you from using it at least some of the time. There was a big nerf to the Night Spinner, perhaps the single unit that most needed it. Its ability previously stopped you from advancing. Now it is a more standard -2 to move, advance and charge that is seen in quite a lot of places in the game. I feel like that's a bit more tolerable compared with what it was before. Still a pretty handy utility piece to be able to hand that out basically wherever it wants across the map and threaten some nasty devastating wounds. But now you're also going to be paying quite a bit more for it as well. It's gone all the way up to 210 points from 180. I think that's reached the points cost where that's no longer going to be spammed. I still think that perhaps 1 as a utility piece could still be interesting though. The Incarn got a big nerf to its Death Teleport ability. You can only do it on your turn and not in the opponent's turn, so that does remove some of the shenanigans that you can do with it. Still seems solid though, and both it and the Avatar of Cain are both very scary units, and they didn't increase in points. Finally, as well as the Fate's Messenger thing that was commonly used on them, Wraithguard both received a points and a rules nerf on top of that. They went up to 190 over 380. So significantly more expensive for that big toughness profile and Wraith Cannon action, and their scary return fire thing was also nerfed and quite heavily. You can now only return fire on the unit that shot at you, so it means that if they're getting plinked by things that are out of their range, they're not just going to be able to turn around and delete something completely different, which I must admit did feel like a strange way of doing things before. Overall, it really is a pretty serious cluster of nerfs there. It's not like there's not going to be plenty of strong stuff for the faction though. Anti-tank things weren't touched, Illic and Rangers and their scoring units are nice, the Avatar of Cain is still pretty much as good as it was before, bar a few fate dice, and overall I feel like this is probably enough to knock the Aeldari a lot more down towards mid-tier, but I don't think it's going to ruin the faction by any means. There's going to be plenty of interesting units to fill the gaps here. I would say that these changes are going to be enough to make them no longer the single strongest army in 40k, which might be a bit of a relief really, given it's been that way since the start of 10th. For the Darkkin, they were at the other end of the power spectrum. They did a rules change that I was actually kind of hoping for specifically. Basically they've boosted power from pain in melee by a little bit. If you throw a pain token at a unit charging into melee, not only do you get the hit rerolls, but you also get an extra AP -1. I genuinely thought that would be a really nice way of making them a bit more dangerous there, as it just tends to be a lot more effective on things like Dark Lancers and the melee units for Drukhari felt a bit underpowered. Things like witches and incubi and grotesques and things will certainly punch a fair bit harder with both hit rerolls and more AP. Otherwise, as a bit of fan service, Games Workshop allowed the Archon to lead the Incubi squad again. It was weird that they were locked out of it, given that it's their iconic bodyguard unit from the lore. It could make an Archon with a Pain Token Incubi unit into a genuinely blendy combat threat. Otherwise, they've seen a whole raft of points decreases, Grotesque down to 90 from 105, Drazar down to 75 from 90, Helions and Reavers that were both kind of rarely played both drop, Incubi down to 75 points, the Raider and Venoms are down to 80 points and 70 points respectively, both a 10-point drop there, and I feel like those are standout good changes for the faction. Raiders and Venoms were already making their way into competitive lists, and that's going to allow you to feel like they're a unit that you might want to have lots of for your different transported squads now. Definitely a good way of amping up the power of the faction overall. Otherwise, the Witch Succubus is super cheap, as it was a unit that was rarely taken, and perhaps for maybe the single biggest and most impactful change, Talos dropping down from 90 to 80, I think is perhaps a surprising move. They were already perhaps the single unit that tended to be most spammed in competitive lists. A lot of them just use a lot of pain engines, maybe backed up by some Dark Lance platforms and Cabalites and Raiders, and giving one of the strongest units in the index a good points decrease, I feel like is just going to cement them even more as an auto-include. Otherwise, for some reason they decided to nerf the Void Raven Bomber, going up to 215 from 195. It was a strong unit for them, but by no means overpowered in my opinion. It seems that in 10th edition, Games Workshop just don't really want aircraft as a big part of the competitive game. They seem to nerf them whenever they get good. Finally, as mentioned earlier in the video, they did add an entirely new detachment as well, the Sky Splinter Assault detachment. That's a whole new thing, and I'll cover that in its own video review, as I think it kind of warrants it being such a big new change and lots of rules to pore over. Generally speaking though, a really big cluster of buffs for the Drukhari. I think this will have people a lot more excited to play the faction, and you could definitely get a bunch more models on the table. Lots of scary skimmer boats with a whole load of nasty contents pouring out from inside. Let me know which ones you think are the most standout units from the points changes here. For the Tyranids, Games Workshop do seem to have tried to rebalance a few things that got some odd nerfs in the previous index update. The Tyranids didn't actually get any core rules changes at all, it's only points updates here. Previously they were sort of maybe lower mid-tier in terms of power rating. And it does seem at least that the buffs outweigh the nerfs slightly. A few units are generally looking a lot more interesting for competitive sort of play. First up, the Broodlord went down to 80 and the Genestealers down to 75. Small but meaningful points decreases there. I think they were already kind of playable in the Vanguard Onslaught, will certainly make them into a lot more interesting there. Nice fast moving infantry maulers. The Norn Emissary and the Norn Assimilator both go down a bit, dropping down to 275 and 290. I guess most people will probably still choose to go for the Emissary out of the two. A big tanky and somewhat scary monster that you can move towards midfield objectives when they get super tough. Previously not bad, now probably getting a bit more standout. There's been a nice points decrease on the iconic Screamer Killer from Leviathan, dropping all the way down to 145 from 170. That feels far more in line with its abilities, and I'm sure people will be excited to put them on the table with a cheaper points cost. The Tyrannifex gets its stupid points increase reversed, going down from 245 to 190. Previously people were using those with the acid spray for a nasty overwatch threat in the midfield. They're still very tanky and they'll still do that fine. I think 190 points is enough to have them interesting enough for competitive lists again. The Toxicrin goes down from 180 to 150, so it's a lot cheaper for the monster that's quite good at killing infantry and might lock things in combat a bit. I still think it might struggle to be taken too much given that it just doesn't deal with hard things that much, but you definitely feel a lot better about taking one if you want to. And the Trigon goes down a little bit from 180 to 170, could be interesting as a rapid ingress threat. Otherwise though, they have seen a few small nerfs to some of their staple units. Paravors go up from 30 to 35, but still on individuals, that's still a lot of tough wounds for very cheap. They're not bad as ball control units. The Neurolictor takes the single biggest relative points increase, going from 65 to 80. They were pretty undercosted before, and I still think that they're playable there, though you will be weighing them up against the other options more. Deathleaper goes up from 70 to 80, and he's still great, will still get played in most army lists I guess, and Gargoyles go up a little bit, 75 to 80. Most competitive lists were running maybe one or two units of those with their interesting drop them move sort of shenanigans that they can do. I don't think a 5-point increase is going to make any difference to how much they're played there. Overall, not the worst changes for Tyranids in my opinion. A few units genuinely get a lot more interesting with the Norns, the Broodlord, the Genestealers, the Screamer Killer and the Tyrannifex, and the things that go up maybe weren't things that most lists wanted to spam all that much, and by kind of smallish amounts. Maybe not the worst Dataslate update overall. For their devoted Genestealer Cults, the previous nerfs are unchanged. They still have their Cult Ambush mechanic on a 5+, with a +1 to battle line and early in the battle round. The only change that their faction got was the Pure Strain Genestealers dropping in line with the ones in Codex Tyranids. They've dropped down from 85 to 75. I'd say that's enough to genuinely make them look pretty interesting as a result, if you wanted a few squads in the army to either take the midfield or threaten to take out enemy infantry. Otherwise, nothing else really altered. Some other units I'd argue were kind of worse, such as the Mages, maybe the Metamorphs or the Rock Grinder could have gone down a bit. Overall, still an interesting enough faction though. I feel like most armies will still be building around the hybrid Neophytes and Acolytes. The Leagues of Votann had been having a rather good time of it in 10th edition. Since Games Workshop gave those big boosts in the previous Balance Dataslate, they still get to keep their 4 units marked for death at the start of the first battle round, so they're still going to be +1 to hit and wound against a whole bunch of stuff within the enemy army, though they did take a few points nerfs, the Sagittor going up to 115, the Brockir Thunderkin to 85 and the Einhir Hearthguard to 160. I'd say that those units are exactly the ones that most deserve the nerfs, and internal codex balance will be a bit better as a result. I'd say that is going to make the faction into a more middle-of-the-road one as opposed to stand out good in more casual games as they are at the moment, even if they were an army that weren't necessarily topping tournaments all the time. I still say that all 3 of those units are perfectly usable at those points costs, though it is definitely going to be a nerf to the faction, given that they have such a limited unit roster. Perhaps a bit of a relative buff to the Hexagon Land Fortress, which looks a lot more efficient as a result versus the Sagitors. I'm sure that the Hearthguard will remain played in very good numbers as well. That's not really a very big relative points increase for a unit that could be really quite scary. For the Tower Empire, given that they've previewed the Kroot box set, it does seem that there's a good chance they're the next codex in line. As a result, they don't seem to have gotten any core rules changes. They did get a few points slightly messed around with. The Crisis Commanders that aren't Cold Star battlesuits go down a little bit to 80 for the regular one, 90 for the Enforcer. The Cold Star one I think will probably remain the most popular though, given the big movement boost it can do with the Crisis suits. The suits themselves go up from 180 to 200, that really does hurt quite a lot. I will probably make them a bit less tempting as a choice overall, I'd say. Not the best for one of the faction's scariest damage dealers. Otherwise, the Riptide got a fairly significant points decrease, dropping from the already, I thought, at least fairly cheap 180 points down to 165. They're not a unit that does the most damage in the world versus other units in the Tau Codex, but they're already fairly tanky for 180 points and even more so at 165. I feel like they're going to be even more tempting in competitive play now. Otherwise, Vespids are 65 points down from 75, really quite nice for a cheap unit to do secondary objectives and things, so a bit more helpful there. Otherwise, one unit that I was wondering about was the Forge World Tetras that allows some big rerolls to hit against certain units within the index. Pretty much the best guiding unit out there. Looks like Games Workshop haven't chosen to change the Forge World rules for them. It does just seem a bit weird that in competitive play so many Tau lists are taking them as an auto-include. That's pretty much the best marker support out there out of the entire army, and on a unit that's actually really fast, infiltrates, and is genuinely surprisingly tanky for the points cost. For the Orks, it does look like Games Workshop has tried to give a little bit of rebalancing of the range versus melee in the index. Previously, just about all competitive lists were running melee en masse. It does seem that they've taken a few nerfs to maybe some of the most spammed units. Trucks go up again by a little bit, going up to 65 from 60. They'll still be fine and playable with that though. Knobs are 110 points from 105. Still good, and I don't think that's enough to knock them off being used in competitive. Squighog boys go up a bit more though. Previously they were 110 points and now go up to 125. I feel like that might genuinely make people think twice about using them versus some of the other good melee options in the army. I still wouldn't say they're bad at that kind of cost. Otherwise though, they get far more buffs to other units. Battle wagons and kill rigs both dropped by pretty significant margins. I think people will be a lot more tempted to use those as transports versus the trucks now. That's not to say that the trucks aren't still good. Otherwise, the October buggies all go down a little bit. I'm still not convinced that most of them are really looking like efficient damage dealers for the points, but they're kind of fast and somewhat tough interference units that could just be an annoyance threat as they deal some range damage. There were definitely models that needed points cost reductions. Killer Cans seem like they're one of the biggest winners out of the index, going down to 125 from 150, really quite a big points decrease on those. We genuinely might see a few more of those. And the Morkanaut goes down a bit from 330 to 295. Seems like Games Workshop thinks that needed a lot more help than the Gorkanaut. Overall, I feel like maybe that isn't the worst changes for the Orky army. It's definitely having some big steps towards internal balance. All of the units that got buffed are things that needed it, and the things that got nerfed are some of the most auto-include units. I'd say that all the things that got nerfed at least remain playable. Finally, that leaves us with the Necrons, who, like the Admech, seem to have no changes whatsoever in this update. There's been no changes to points and no rules changes, though I guess in their FAQ they did have that on-the-nose nerf to the devastating wound stratagem that you could do with Immortals in Canoptek Court, though probably that one might be for the best really, given that they could just farm out crazy amounts of devastating wounds on anything that set foot on an objective, and do it on multiple units per turn with overlords about. I feel like Necrons might well rise to be perhaps the single strongest faction in Warhammer 40k as a result here. They were already winning lots of tournaments in competitive play versus things like Chaos Space Marines and Aeldari, Canoptek Court and Hypercrypt Legion being the ways to go. As with Admech, I feel like Games Workshop really could have helped out by making a few changes here. The Catan shards seem pretty much undercosted, as there's plenty of people that look like they're running lists that are spamming loads of them, even if that might not be optimal. And wraiths with Technomancers do feel a bit oppressive compared with some of the other more battle line options in the army, just to be a helpful combination of tough and fast moving. There are plenty of things within the codex that could have used help as well, particularly Necron warriors, though there are a whole bunch of other units that I think could have used boosts. Overall though, I'd say it's perhaps a bit of a mixed reaction to this balanced data slate, at least from me anyway. I feel like some factions will absolutely be loving this, they got lots of attention and a lot of the changes seem sensible, whereas some armies got neglected or got nerfed far more than I would have guessed they would. It's definitely good news for some of the things that I would have ranked as some of the weakest armies in the game, Custodes, Knights and Drukhari, and there were somewhat expected nerfs to Aeldari and Chaos Space Marines at the other end of the spectrum. Beyond that though, I feel like Codex Space Marines has come off pretty poorly out of this. Seems like Games Workshop have tried to nerf some top army builds while keeping the just general faction as pretty weak. For the Sisters, I kind of like their changes and I feel like they'll still be strong. The Guard got one good change with Orders, one bad change with Manticores, a bit nothingy really beyond that. I like the changes to the Grey Knight Dread Knights, but I'm not sure if it's going to help them actually be one of the top armies in the game, though it's probably a small improvement on before, even with the Librarian nerf. Death Guard and Thousand Suns I think remain in an okay place. World Eaters were hit a bit heavier than I was expecting. Chaos Demons getting a bit more love than I was expecting, and maybe the same with Chaos Knights as well, considering that their win rates at tournaments weren't really too bad either. Otherwise, fairly sensible changes for Tyranids on the whole I think, though not everything was really addressed. Leagues of Votann are definitely going to lose a bit of power. Tau Empire got helped with Riptides but nerfed with Crisis Suits, in any case their codex is out soon, and Orks may be a bit better for internal balance without losing too much strength. Overall, I would say that there's probably more positives than negatives to take away here, even if it does seem that Games Workshop hasn't got everything right in my opinion. I feel like the single biggest disappointment are no changes to Admech and Necrons. I do know it's somewhat early in the days from Games Workshop's balance perspective when the codex has only been out a month or so, but I would have liked to see them be a little bit braver with those. In any case, let me know what you think, look forward to hearing all your takes down in the comments below, and certainly point out any other obvious things that I've missed. I'm sure there'll be some things in such a massive update. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll hopefully be making a few rapid fire videos to follow this up. Dark Angel's points cost, a focused look at Space Marines and Tyranids, and a review of that new Drukhari detachment, albeit early on, plus delving into a few of those rules changes from the designer's commentary. Feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see any or all of that. In any case, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main way that I can keep on making videos like this quite so regularly whenever big updates for the game drop. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.